Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Smith, President and CEO of Airlink. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Flightpath. Here we aim to highlight innovation, deliver insight, actionable guidance, and lessons in best practice to people working in the humanitarian response and disaster logistics space, all from experienced organizational leaders. Now, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. So my guest today is a geographer and a humanitarian. His career has focused on introducing and applying innovations in data and technology to some of the world's most biggest challenges. He's currently Chief Executive Officer of international disaster response NGO REACT. And prior to his current role, he led a transformational change program as Chief of Data and Analytics at UNICEF. And before that, he led the management information team at DFID, now I guess called the FCDO. And in previous regional humanitarian roles at UNICEF, he managed responses in the Central African Republic, Cameroon, Chad, Libya, and Yemen. And his early career was focused on geospatial data, including roles with the World Health Organization and Ordnance Survey. And he holds a PhD in remote sensing and an MBA from INSEAD. Toby Wicks, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. What a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
It's great. It's great to have you with us, and thanks for your partnership. We're good partners on many fronts. So, just to kick off, for those listeners that aren't all that familiar about REACT, tell me a little bit about REACT and what you do.
So REACT is, I call it 5 years young, right? It's an interesting story. Created 5 years ago, initially with the idea of international disaster response and really harnessing and repurposing the power of highly trained, highly experienced volunteers and focusing on them on direct humanitarian action in the immediate aftermath of crises. And those volunteers come from a breadth of different backgrounds, many from the military, so veterans, but also what we call blue lighters, so ambulance, fire, police, and also just civilians who are keen to lean in the space. So sudden onset disaster response internationally. But then COVID hits, of course, and the organization pivoted very dramatically to being a domestic response force. And so quite a defining moment for the organization a couple of years ago. I joined just over 6 months ago, and now with this idea of pushing both at the same time, so both domestic and international response.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, 6 months and, very strange time of COVID. You said, as you just said, you have to, the team had to pivot, during that time. And, international travel is very difficult, of course, for all of us. But I often find, when someone comes in that's new, that takes the lead, there's often sort of a new angle or new path that's laid. And, so as a leader of REACT, talk to me a little bit about, how you see that playing out in the future and the role that you play in that.
Brilliant question. I mean, I sleep really well. There's not much that gives me sleepless nights apart from, I suppose, if one of my 3 kids does wake me up, what gives me a hard time getting back to sleep is the challenge of volume, right? REACT is an organization that is running at pace, both domestically and internationally. And then if you superimpose on that the need to change, then I think that's a real challenge in terms of maintaining the volume. And at the same time, with a really small, really lean team, how can we manage that delivery at pace and at scale? And at the same time, you get a new leader coming in saying, I think we could be doing this smarter, better, different. So I think you hit the nail on the head with the question there. And if anybody's got any answers as to how to manage those 2 pieces, I'm all ears. I think for me, it does mean that we might have to be slightly bigger as a headquarters team in a short period of time, right? I think we'll have to invest in certain areas in the short term to get better. My 13-year-old boy, when he's tidying his room, hilarious, right? His room's quite a mess and it often gets a lot worse before it gets better. And so I can see the analogies there, thinking, for an organization at times, we might have to go through a few bumpy roads to get us set up for success. But one of the objectives I have for the organization, one of the 4 key strategic objectives is is us as a catalytic core. And I think we have to be really smart, really efficient about aligning the demand side with the appropriate supply of whether that be talent, whether it be data, whether it be supplies. And so that catalytic core needs to be lean and efficient. We might need to invest in the short term to get us where we need to be in the long term. That sounds quite generic. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do. Well, maybe we can pivot and talk about, tell us a little bit about your response in Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
I know we've worked together. We've been able to move a number of your folks in and out, and we're pleased to do that. But talk to me a little bit about your response there, and give a sense for kind of the role that that React plays. I'm sure that this has been fairly unique, and there's been a whole bunch of unique challenges that you've faced as an organization. So talk to me a little bit about your Ukraine response.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, thanks to Airlink, we were very fast out of the blocks, right? We deployed, back into February and had a recce across all of the countries bordering Ukraine to understand the extent to which the refugee responses were being swept up by those neighboring countries, also going into the east of Ukraine. And I think we had, and still have, I suppose, in order of priority, number one, those internally displaced within Ukraine and meeting their needs. Number two, refugees in neighboring countries. And number three, refugees in the UK. And I think in terms of the challenges, number one, I suppose, has to be access, right? This is it's not unique to Ukraine, but I suppose it's a challenge in many of the contexts that we now find ourselves operating in. And I think how we've dealt with that is partnering at pace with local NGOs. And for Ukraine, many of these are in their infancy, right? And so I think that brings up challenges in terms of due diligence. I must say, we've been very fortunate to have, a lot of gravitas within the organization in terms of legal firepower to be able to help us on the due diligence piece. But I think having those rapidly identified local partners in situ who can articulate the needs, that is absolutely fundamental and has been pivotal to our response in Ukraine. And I suppose mitigating the challenges around access, that would be number one. Number two, I suppose, the protracted nature of Ukraine, right? We're now well over 100 days in terms of the conflict. And I think that is manifesting itself in a number of different ways, right? I think we feel it internally, but I think we're fortunate, right? We've got a big volunteer base and we're able to, again, thanks to the phenomenal support of Airlink, rotate in. So that gives us the possibility to, refresh the talent in situ. But we're also now noticing it in terms of the local partners as well, right? We've just deployed a team to Poland yesterday because the NGO reaching out to us and saying, their effort had been manned by Ukrainian refugees who are either returning or themselves, absolutely on their knees. And so interesting for us to see not only internally what that means in terms of that protracted piece, but also for our implementing partners as well. And I suppose last, I would say that how those two things play together, right? So challenging access over a long period of time. And the combination of those things means that for me, one of the lessons learned is the advantage of having or not having single points of failure or dependence on one particular relationship or supply chain. I think if I think back to my stats professor, he used to, negotiations, strong on stats negotiations, used to say to me, Toby, always have a BATNA, right? BATNA being a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And you can see it playing out in these scenarios, right? In simple terms, have options. In the event that a particular local NGO burns out, gets maxed out, has to pivot, then, how can we make sure that we have a number of different opportunities? So I think those things probably challenges around access, challenges around a protracted emergency, and then how those things play together. But we're incredibly fortunate, I think, as an organization. And the last thing I would say is, flicked across my social media feed about half an hour ago, an absolutely delightful photograph of the team landing in Poland yesterday, right? And that the flights from Airlink are, they're a game changer. For a small organization like us, they make the difference between a go and a no-go decision. But it's not only that, right? Have a look at the photos, Steve. Go and have a look at our LinkedIn page, because you can see the smiles from ear to ear from the team. And not only that, right? They've pulled in the whole of the flight crew. So they've got the pilots and everybody there. And that signals to me that, yes, the flights are transformational, but it's much more than that, right? For the team that are deploying now, it's a feeling of we're in this together, right? And I think that as they set foot on the tarmac, they don't quite know what they're going to see, but to have the confidence of deploying in partnership, I think it's just massive.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yep, the airlines are pretty tremendous. We like them a lot. That's good, and we're happy to support. But and thank you for the compliments. Talk to me. Although I was aware of your team. You talked about access and those things. I'm aware that your team went in and recently set up its own sort of supply chain distribution network with a number of partners. You talked about issues with access. I'm interested, as a leader of the organization, you had the team going in. Is that what was on the menu when you first went in, or is that's all part of the reconnaissance, the analysis that your team goes in? Talk to me a little bit through that.
Yeah, it's the latter, Steve. And that's one of the things actually that attracted me to the organization, right? It's that there aren't these predefined responses. And it's really, for me, the direction of travel of the humanitarian world is in this accountability to affected populations. What are the needs, right? How can we understand from a local level and locally driven responses what's required? And so for me, that's the excitement of it. We're in Sierra Leone and it's a water solution. We're in Ukraine and it's food, power, water, sanitation, hygiene. And so I think that agility for me is exciting. One of the challenges, therefore, that we have as an organization, though, is pitching that, right? Because we're not a well-defined organization that only does shelter or only does wash. We will deploy rapidly, assess what's needed, and then partner at pace to try and match those needs with the appropriate responses. So that for me is exciting. For me, it's the way forward. And I've got that complex challenge in a way of selling that to other stakeholders, particularly donors, right? Because I can't say to you in advance, your funds will contribute to 10,000 tents in Sierra Leone. And so there's the challenge. But I think for me, that comes with trust, right? That comes with, as with any partnership over time, understanding that experience. So that's the answer in a nutshell. We don't ever know, really. We can have some ideas, right? We can have some ideas about what we're going to see, but it's not a cookie cutter approach. And I think that's something that I'm actually quite proud of.
That's great. That's great. And so this is almost sort of an impossible question to answer, really. But how long do you see your intervention continuing in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I had a radio interview, very similar question yesterday. I was saying my crystal ball is a little bit murky on this one. I think the short answer is for as long as the needs are there. I think, but again, it brings about a longer or a bigger challenge for me. And it sounds a very strange thing to say, but what's the exit strategy? And that could be for anything, right? That could be for any response. I read a brilliant paper by a professor at Wharton, a chap called Gregory O'Shea. And the paper's called something like The Problem with Heroes. I really recommend it. It's a brilliant read. It's actually quite short. And in essence, or my takeaway from it was, as leaders, sure, we've got the opportunity to celebrate heroes in our teams, but at the same time, there's a challenge there in that if they are consistently heroes, i.e. filling gaps that are systemic, that's highlighting a big issue. And I think, so for me, that's the challenge, right? That's the challenge related to an exit strategy for any response, whether that be Ukraine or any other emergency. We're seeing it domestically as well, right? How do we make sure that we deploy quickly, we support the capacity to be able to sustain itself and then move back. I think we've done it really well in Moldova. Again, with support from Airlink, we had a team in there 2 weeks, short, sharp, put in place a system to help a charity there, Moldova for Peace, set up a sustainable system to manage spontaneous volunteers. And for me, that's what great looks like: a relatively short intervention, building local capacity, supporting them, and then being able to monitor and support as necessary. But I think that's not easy. We'll be in Ukraine and supporting Ukraine for as long as it makes sense.
Yeah, that's obviously the goal, is to try to help set these communities up so they can continue supporting themselves. But that's difficult to do right now.
And again, for Ukraine, right? We're not talking about another necessarily classic humanitarian context. There's great capacity there, and I think so there's nuance there too.
Yeah, right. Well, you mentioned it a little bit earlier. You mentioned a good number of volunteers that you have. You're able to cycle in. Great. We're excited to help you with that. But one of the things is, humanitarian sector was very much a burnout sector before COVID, right? And people's capacity and getting tired. I mean, you as the leader of React coming in, 6 months in, this is obviously a big topic for you, right? I saw some articles on your website about this. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's massive. I think it's I think about it both internally and externally. From an internal perspective, React has a delightful value, right? It has several. One of them is selfless commitment. And I think for me, and I had a lovely conversation. I don't know if you know Tyler Radford, the executive director of Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. I was in Geneva with him a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about exactly this, right? How we need to, as leaders in the humanitarian space, define and articulate what we mean by that, because selfless commitment could be interpreted to mean, you're on no matter what time of day, night, and you're expected to step up. And so I think when we ever put out value statements like that, we really need to define our expectations and what good looks like. So I think internally there's a challenge. I think also for an organization like ours, for a voluntary organization, right, the expectations are important. And I think definitely it's clear to me that I need to put the scaffolding in place, because having worked in other organizations and having volunteers that have worked in other organizations, for me, React is not yet good enough at setting the boundaries. And in bigger organizations, in bigger bureaucracies, right, that have the systems and the processes in place, it's hard for me. I was coming from UNICEF, right? UNICEF wouldn't let me deploy back to back on 3, for example, complex emergencies, or there would be systems in place to take rest and recuperation. And I think for small organizations that are to a certain extent building themselves as we fly, that I think is really important. Getting in place good enough policies, but it's not just a policy, right? You've got to then implement the thing to make sure that, we're good enough at walking the talk and putting those boundaries in place to look after our teams, whether they be the volunteers or the staff or the trustees for that matter. And I think when the causes and the missions are so compelling, it's beholden on us, as you say, as the leaders, to make sure that we're putting those boundaries in place. And then I think compounded by externally the volume, right? The volume stretches there and it's only getting bigger. So internally, you've got the challenge of the talent who want to give more and more and more. Externally, you've got the challenge of the volume that is increasing nearly exponentially, right? And so you've got to be able to reconcile those ways. And that, for me, the opportunity to put a plan in place, I think, is also really important, right? React has grown really fast, really quick, and that's normal. That's like a startup, right? And it's gone from 0 to 1 in pretty short order. And now we need to go from 1 to 10 with a plan, and not only a plan, but a plan that is adequately resourced, so we can do this in a smart way and, with an emphasis on duty of care. So I think that matters. And I think also, again, it relates to the point I was making earlier about that article, right? About heroes are good once off, but these need to be triggers, right? If we see people going above and beyond consistently, then that should be a signal to us as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sure does. And it's certainly hard to say no to so many compelling things and needs around the world. That's for sure. We have the same issues. I mean, related to that, right? The humanitarian sector in general. Your experience in UNICEF, now your experience here with React. It's a very fragmented, crowded space, right? We've got Ukraine, we've got famine in the north of in the Horn of Africa, we've got major refugee situations elsewhere, South Sudan, lots of things going on around the world that need humanitarian assistance. Let's face it, the donor community's propensity to give is often sort of very much linked to the media cycle, which means some of those lesser well-known situations are very, very underfunded. I think you've already touched on it, but assuming no organization can do everything, as the leader of React, how are you thinking about prioritizing, focusing? You've mentioned that you're already operating elsewhere, but talk to me a little bit about how you're approaching all of the needs that are presented in front of you.
So as I mentioned, I'm in the process of writing a strategic plan, which I'm really enjoying, more for the process actually, rather than the plan in and of itself. It's a wonderful opportunity to join an organization and have that moment to say, okay, what do we want to achieve? What's realistic and how do we go? And the working title for the strategy is Disaster Response is a Team Sport. And I genuinely believe that, right? I genuinely believe, particularly for an organization like us, that is, in the grand scheme of things, tiny. It's about, exactly as I was saying earlier, articulating the demand and then being smart about partnering at pace and saying, this is what we're seeing in a open, collaborative, transparent way. So I think, again, the challenge is the scale. One of my former colleagues at UNICEF used to say to me, look, Toby, we can't rest until we can say with confidence that the very last adolescent girl in, pick a country, Northeast Nigeria, with a disability has access to the services she needs, right? And that excites me on a number of different levels, right? Number one, that I think probably defines us as humanitarians, right? We're saying genuinely, no one left behind, number one. But number two, the use of disaggregated data to be able to say with confidence, yes, the very last adolescent girl with a disability in Northeast Nigeria has access to the services she needs. So that is putting the bar about as high as you can, right? And then superimpose a scale that we've just been talking about. And I think that for me is the challenge for the humanitarian system at large. And then we have to think about, okay, as organizations, what's our individual contribution to that piece? How can we add most value? I think, one of the first decisions I made joining React was to say, no, we won't deploy to Mozambique because there's enough capacity there already. There are organizations that are better placed than us to respond. And I think having the confidence to do that, and it was interesting that the board said to me at that time, that's a mature approach. We're not used to that. And I think, therefore, we need to be smarter, more honest, more humble about really being smart about, exactly, where can we make a contribution and understanding our limits. So I look forward to sharing the draft strategy with you, Steve. I'd love your thoughts on disaster response as a team sport. And I suppose one of the other React values is humility, right? I think we need to be really clear with ourselves about the limits to what we can achieve. So I think that matters. And I have been so pleasantly surprised by, you're talking about fatigue in the donor community. Yeah, maybe I'm not feeling that. I'm certainly seeing a lot of support from partners across the board for Ukraine, and I mean, big and small. We've made some very new nascent partnerships, but also some of the big guns, right? Amazon, for example. We've been rubbing shoulders with Amazon for a while, since the Afghan response, refugees in the UK. And I think, it's just been a dream, so easy. And again, because we've been able to really clearly articulate the needs at a very granular level, right? To the point of sharing spreadsheets or databases saying, this is what's needed. And when you can have that level of focus and that level of clarity, I think that then supports. So yes, there is to some extent, donor fatigue, but I have been really, really pleasantly surprised by how easy it has been to partner at pace for Ukraine. And I think, I was going to say pushing open doors, but I'm not even sure there are doors there. So that encourages me. And that encourages me when we can be, again, clear about what's on the demand side, locally led, and then do whatever we can together to match it.
No, that's great. No, there's certainly a big outpouring of support for Ukraine, that's for sure. And, I think there's some good work. What a difficult situation across the board. So, we're almost up on time, but is there anything else? I was going to ask you a question about what you feel positive about, but I think you just answered it. Is there anything else you want to leave us with for the listeners of the podcast here? Sort of closing comments.
I'll say one more thing about Airlink, if I can. And
sure, okay.
It's also what I feel positive about, right? I think we need to be bold and ambitious. I don't know if you remember, Steve, but the very first conversation we had about 6 months ago, I was talking to you about anticipatory action, right? And the ability to get ahead of the curve. Because for organizations like React, helping afterwards is valuable. But, diminishing the harm caused is absolutely priceless. And so I'm excited that, to me at least, Steve, we're at the start of what I think is going to be a phenomenal partnership. And I think we will need to be bold, right? We will need to be ambitious. Given all of the challenges we've just spoken about, given the scale, we need to a certain extent, get ahead of this. And so, for example, us deploying in an anticipatory fashion ahead of has the potential to be transformational. And I think the more we can be challenging of each other in a trusted partnership, then sky's the limit. Excuse the pun.
It's okay. You can have it. It's good. Okay. No, I appreciate it. And it's good conversations, and we appreciate the partnership. And so, Toby, thanks so much for joining me. I think that's probably all we have time for today. Thanks so much for sharing your story. And I wish you and your team, you have a great team, all the best. And we stand by and ready to support your efforts. There you go. There's the COVID coming. Now, to my audience, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to speaking with you on the next Flightpath episode. All the best for now. Thanks a lot.